At DJ Biggs 2 days ago. Exit left : Minion. Happy Black History Month FBA. FBA DNA hip hop all day. At Incredible Hulk 777. DJ Biggs bro, let me tell you something about Black history. The reason why Black history exists today is because a Puerto Rican named Arturo Alfonso Schomburg created it with over 10 million artifacts that he collected from around the world and put it all in a museum in New York so that American blacks and all blacks from around the world can see and study their history and culture. So, in short words, a Puerto Rican is the father of Black history. Google it. At Incredible Hulk 777. The father of Black American history is a Puerto Rican named Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Whoever is not familiar with him does not study Black history. He took manuscripts, books, poems, artworks and even letters written by Toussaint Louverture and put them all in a museum for Black studies. Nobody had done that before. Whatever you know about Black revolutionaries is because he preserved it for you back then. If not, it would have been destroyed and wiped out long ago. At DJ Biggs. Incredible Hulk 777, keep FBA and Black American history out of your mouth. Much respect to FBA Dr. Carter G. Woodson, Ph.D. from Harvard University, who created Black American History Month. Forever remembered legend. Rest in power. In an address before the American Moral Reform Society on August 17, 1837, James Forten, an African-American writer, abolitionist, and businessman, eloquently charged a group of his fellow brethren and advocated for the development of literary institutions to improve the intellect and morality among African-American people. He asserted, "I conceive our literary institutions to have the power of doing. It seems to me, then, that the main object is to accomplish an intellectual and moral reformation. And I know of but few better ways to effect this than by reading, by examining, by close comparisons and thorough investigations, by exercising the great faculty of thinking, for, if a man can be brought to think, he soon discovers that his highest enjoyment consists in the improvement of the mind. It is this that will give him rich ideas, and teach him, also, that his limbs were never made to wear the chains of servitude. He will see too that equal rights were intended for all." I uncovered this address while sifting through printed archives of African American literary societies of the 1800s. The sifting began with an interest to examine if and how these literary institutions cultivated the literacy development of African Americans throughout the 19th century. As a former secondary English language arts and history teacher, I understand the significance of blending meaningful reading and writing experiences while teaching history. As I learned more about these literary institutions that James Forten referred to in African American literacy development, I began to make connections to the storied lives and pursuits of the past and how history could be used to improve the quality of reading and writing experiences for middle and high school students. Throughout the 1800s, a central objective among African Americans in the North was to improve and elevate the condition of people of African descent through a literary means. As illustrated in the excerpt from James Forten's address, the ways in which African Americans set out to counter the devastating conditions they endured during a time of racism and oppression was through reading and discussing literary texts. As part of a broader struggle to counter multiple attacks of oppression, they used their minds and their pens as weapons to battle injustice. Books and other texts, e.g., pamphlets, government documents, newspapers, became ammunition to fuel and elevate their lives. They knew that if they could work toward cultivating their minds and morals through acts of literacy, they would be equipped to face and alter the nation's harshest realities and countless attacks of terror placed upon African American people. Reading and writing were more than a set of skills for African Americans to possess, they were pathways to define their lives and advocate for civil rights. To this end, African Americans developed literary institutions, specifically literary societies, which were essentially collaborative spaces used to construct knowledge and engage each other to become literate. African American literary societies were also called reading rooms, lyceums, and debating societies. These were more than just associations or spaces to discuss literature, they had wider goals of benefiting the conditions of African Americans and the wider society. These societies were large and small and were both gender-specific and unisex. The earlier societies were for men only. African American women subsequently created their own literary societies. Within these groups, African Americans of different ages would gather around texts they identified as meaningful and significant to encourage and improve reading, writing, and speaking skills, share knowledge, promote ideas and cultivate a scholarly and literate way of life. Members in these societies met regularly in basements of churches, buildings with classrooms, libraries, private homes, and auditoriums for events, such as public addresses or debates that drew large crowds. They also paid membership dues regularly, which supported texts to furnish libraries and other expenses. Like most organizations, they wrote and published preambles and constitutions, which outlined the rules and regulations that were expected from its members. African American literary societies began in urban, free cities such as Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, New York City, Boston, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. in the mid-19th century. At this time, there were approximately 599 free black people living in the United States *, yet although they were openly free, they were frequently subject to hostility, abuse, and had a number of restrictions placed upon them imbued with discrimination. The Reading Room Society for Men of Color formed in Philadelphia on May 28, 1828 was one of the first societies. William Whipper, a businessman and leader of several other institutions, served as the guiding spirit of this group and was instrumental in its formation. Other societies with similar objectives quickly followed the installment of the Reading Room Society. Among them were the New York African Clarkson Society in 1829, the New York Philomathean Society in 1830, the Philadelphia Library Company of Colored Persons in 1833. The Rush Library and Debating Society in 1836, the Young Men's Literary and Moral Reform Society of Pittsburgh and vicinity in 1837, the Young Men's Literary Society in Boston in 1845, and the Banneker Institute of the City of Philadelphia in 1854. Among the African American women literary societies were the Female Literary Society formed in 1831, Ladies Literary Society formed in 1834, and Ladies Literary and Dorcas Society formed in 1833.
So where we at today? We are at the David Ruggles boarding house. So some history about David Ruggles. David Ruggles was born in Norwich, Connecticut around 1810. Around 1830, he moved to New York City, where he was a part of an anti-slavery movement. He had his own grocery store, which he converted to a library, because why? African Americans was denied access to public libraries in New York City. It became the first black-owned library in New York City. Shortly after, it was destroyed, though, by the mob. Why? The scriptures say, Nehemiah 2:10, that anytime somebody rises up for their people, it grieved the nations. So it grieved the mob. That's why he destroyed his library. At his new location in Lisbonard Street, David Ruggles' home served as a boarding house for the Underground Railroad, where he helped many enslaved African Americans with food, with shelter. Also, very renowned writer Frederick Douglass, he was also here. Family, tune in next time for more history that you may have not known.
David Ruggles, 1810 to 1849, abolitionist and journalist, was the earliest known Afro-American collector and book dealer. Ruggles was born of free parents in Norwich, Connecticut, and later moved to New York, where he owned a grocery store. In 1834 he opened a bookshop near Broadway in Lower Manhattan, where he stocked a large collection of anti-slavery and anti-colonization literature. Here he also maintained a circulating library from which, for a small fee, readers could borrow materials for use at home. In the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, the city of Philadelphia was a hub of black literary and research societies, which fostered the work of many pioneer black bibliophiles. The earliest known group was the Reading Room Society, founded in 1828. Another early group was the Banneker Literary Institute, named for Benjamin Banneker, the black 18th-century mathematician and compiler of almanacs. It was established in 1854 with 37 members who were expected to deliver papers on various aspects of black life and history and to participate in debates on racial issues. Two of Philadelphia's pioneer bibliophiles were inspired by the activities of the Banneker Institute. March 15, 1858. Image description. Correspondence to members of Philadelphia's Banneker Institute announcing a meeting to appoint delegate to the Literary Congress. Include signatures, G. E. Stevens, Parker J. Smith, Jacob C. White. Several signature illegible. Memo addressed to President of the Banneker Institute George S. Bunnell. The Banneker Literary Institute, named after black mathematician Benjamin Banneker, was one of several literary and debating societies in 19th-century Philadelphia. Organized in 1854 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania by a group of prominent men, the Banneker Institute promoted literary and other intellectual endeavors. Members were expected to deliver lectures and participate in debates on a variety of subjects, including politics, literature, philosophy, and astronomy. In order to maintain exclusivity and solidarity, prospective members had to be nominated by a current member and demonstrate some intellectual aptitude. Such important persons as Jacob C. White, Jr., Robert M. Adger, and Octavius V. Cato were members of the Institute, which required an entrance fee of 50 cents and $2 in annual dues. The Banneker Institute was the forerunner of the Afro-American Historical Society, which was established in 1879. The records of the Banneker Institute were donated to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania in the 1930s. We find Smith from the summer of 1859 through the spring of 1861 engaged in editing a long treatise on African history by John H. Johnson, Argumentative Observations on the Ancient Civilizations of the Ethiopian or African Race, a work that the Banneker Institute had acquired in manuscript form and hoped to publish. Promising an impartial gathering of the evidence rather than an impassioned plea for equality, Johnson set out to prove the ancestral greatness of his despised race and to defend them from the imputation of natural inferiority. It was the sort of argument, free, as the author put it, from all declamation or sickly sentimentalism, that appealed to Smith's scientific and historical interests. Smith's work on the Johnson manuscript also illustrates the way in which the Banneker Institute focused not only on encouraging the intellectual life of its members but also, more generally, on gathering a historical record of the intellectual life of black Americans. The Institute's members propounded the idea that they were bearers of black intellectual history. They gave this role formal expression later in the 19th century when the Institute became the foundation for the American Negro Historical Society, founded in 1897 by Jacob C. White, Jr., Parker Smith's closest friend. The bibliophile William C. Bolivar, who assembled the Historical Society's library, was also a friend of Smith as well as an early member of the Banneker Institute. As William C. Welburn reminds us in his account of Bolivar, such men saw an activist purpose in gathering the scattered materials of black intellectual culture. Philadelphia had long been a place for the gathering of people as well as the gathering of fragments of black historical memory. It was almost as though this sort of work was meant to offer some measure of counterbalance to the diaspora itself. It was an act of bearing witness. The work was never easy, nor was it especially safe, given the threat of racial violence that ran through Philadelphia and was woven into the fabric of everyday experience, but that made it all the more important. In his account of Philadelphia and the creating of historical memory, Gary Nash points out that Philadelphia was at the center of African American efforts to harness historical consciousness to present-day political aspirations. This was, as John Ernest termed it, the creating of a liberation historiography, a tradition of 19th-century African American writing that enjoined readers to take an active part in tipping history itself towards racial justice.
Alexander Crummell, 1819–1898, was an African-American minister, intellectual, and activist. He was a prominent advocate for the abolition of slavery and the civil rights of African Americans. Crummell also promoted the idea of emigration to Africa as a way for African Americans to escape racial discrimination and build a prosperous future. He founded the American Negro Academy, the first major African American scholarly organization, and spent a significant part of his career in Liberia, where he worked to establish educational and religious institutions.
The American Negro Academy, ANA, was founded by Reverend Alexander Crummell on March 5, 1897 in Washington, D.C. The ANA was the first major black scholarly society in the United States. The founding members of the American Negro Academy were Alexander Crummell, the founding president of the ANA. Crummell was an Episcopal priest, educator, and missionary. He was born in New York to free black ancestry. John Wesley Cromwell, a member of the ANA from Washington, D.C. Paul Lawrence Dunbar, a poet and writer from Washington, D.C. Walter B. Hazen, a member of the ANA. Archibald Grimke, an attorney and writer. Kelly Miller, a scientist and the first black graduate student at Johns Hopkins University. The ANA was an all-male organization that promoted higher education, the arts, and science for African Americans. The ANA's goals included securing equality, destroying racism, and leading and protecting their people.
In Piscataway, Maryland, and was a pioneering African-American historian, journalist, and civil rights activist who made significant contributions to the advancement of African-American history in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Bruce was born into slavery, but he and his family gained their freedom after escaping slavery with his mother and fleeing to Washington, D.C. Growing up in Connecticut, he displayed a keen interest in education and learning from an early age. Bruce was able to enroll in an integrated school because of his family's relationship with a senator from Missouri. He then attended Howard University for 3 months before unenrolling. He never furthered his education formally. All of his education from this point was self-taught. Bruce's passion for writing and storytelling led him to a career in journalism at the age of 18. In 1874, he began his career as a messenger for the associate editor of the New York Times. He helped found several prominent African-American newspapers, including the Argos Weekly, the Sunday Item, and the Republican. In addition to founding his own newspapers, he managed and contributed to several other newspapers. In addition to using his pen to bring attention to the lack of civil rights for Black Americans, he became a highly sought-after lecturer, speaking about Black history and the lynchings of Blacks in America. In 1890, Bruce became a member of the Afro-American League, the first civil rights group in the United States. In 1908, he moved
Still, after starting work at the bank's trust company, through black Freemasonry connections, Schomburg found his most important mentor, the outspoken race journalist, orator, and activist John Edward Bruce. Popularly known as Bruce Grit, Bruce had fled slavery in Maryland as a child with his mother and studied in integrated schools in New England and briefly at Howard University during Emancipation. He eventually settled in the D.C. area to become a maverick of the post-Civil War black press and a Republican Party black leader and advocate during Reconstruction. In 1908, he followed the Great Migration to New York City and settled in Yonkers to become a Prince Hall Freemason leader, a militant Pan-Africanist, a late-in-life Garveyite, and an indefatigable promoter of Negro historical studies. In 1911 he assisted Schomburg in transforming the mixed-race, Spanish-speaking El Sol de Cuba Lodge, where Schomburg had risen to the rank of master, into the mainly black and English-speaking Prince Hall Lodge No. 38. Schomburg, in turn, assisted Bruce in running the Negro Society for Historical Research that Bruce presided over from his Yonkers residence from 1911 until his death in 1924. In 1914 Bruce would persuade historian John Wesley Crummell to induct Schomburg into the American Negro Academy, ANA, an erudite research society gathering the top race scholars and opinion makers instituted in 1889 by Bruce's mentor, the Pan-Africanist professor, diplomat, and Episcopal minister Alexander Crummell. Schomburg rose to become president in 1920 and, after a period of administrative troubles, oversaw its disbandment in 1929. Scholars such as Alfred F. Moss, Jr., author of A History of the ANA, and Ralph L. Crowder and William Serrale, experts on Bruce's career as a Pan-Africanist institution builder, have shown how Bruce's and Schomburg's joint efforts were part of a broader trend involving prospering immigrant and minority community and professional groups that established learned societies to foment ethnic pride and civic agency at the turn of the century. According to Crowder, Bruce mentored Schomburg as part of a cadre of lay historians, critical to his organized effort to popularize African American history. Schomburg and Bruce maintained a father and son relationship for at least 25 years. Bruce and his wife, Florence, also lived with the Schomburg family in Brooklyn for a short time. They were also tied together through a series of organizations that included the NSHR, the ANA, the Loyal Sons of Africa, the Prince Hall Masons, the Pen and Pencil Club, the Men's Sunday Club, the Phalanx Club, and the Friends of Shakespeare Society. Bruce was 18 years older than Schomburg and appreciated his younger colleagues' attention and admiration. Schomburg became Bruce's protege and dedicated partner in the struggle to popularize African American history. Bruce clearly felt an obligation, as he put it, to mentor younger men who thought black. Moreover, he had enjoyed a supportive relationship with the leading Pan-African advocates of the 19th century and looked forward to sharing his experiences with aspiring blacks who could uplift the race. Schomburg became one of the preeminent bibliophiles of his era. Bruce's influence and his numerous contacts greatly facilitated Schomburg's entry into African America and his love affair with collecting books on the black experience.
Especially the idea of fight it out in the courts. That all came from the NAAC that Murray was so involved with. But there was an even stronger political stance that he took, passion, as John called it earlier. And that was the belief that scholarship can be put to the cause of Negro protest. So Murray's goal, Murray said that prejudice is the handmaiden of ignorance. Now, he had started out with this list of 270 works by African American authors. Well, believe me, that was only the beginning. The man became obsessive about carrying out this work. He was allowed to work on it if he had a time here and there at the Library of Congress, but most of it he did in his own time. And it mushroomed. And he moved on. He always continued with the bibliography, but he moved on to biography as well. And then he moved on from African Americans to Euro-Africans as well. And he moved from literature and the polite arts to all fields of endeavor, and then to, as he would put it, the colored race throughout the world. And in the end, and he had mountains and mountains of sketches, 25,000 biographical sketches. In the end, his goal was to produce a 6-volume, 800 pages each, what he called Murray's historical and biographical encyclopedia of the colored race throughout the world. This was his grand vision. This was his opus. Well, sad to say that he never did get to see it published. There was no publisher willing to underwrite an endeavor like that. Carter Woodson, he tried too. W.E.B. Du Bois, he tried too. And it wasn't until the last century of the 20th century, the last year, of the 20th century, that an Encyclopedia Africana saw printer's ink. Now, I am happy.
Daniel P. Murray, 1852 to 1925. Daniel Alexander Payne Murray was born in Baltimore, Maryland, on March 3, 1852, the son of George and Eliza Wilson Murray. He was apparently born of freemen and was educated in Baltimore public schools and at the Unitarian Seminary in his hometown. In 1879, he married Anna Evans of Oberlin, Ohio, and raised 7 children. Murray is a prime example of a librarian of great reputation who was not formally trained as a librarian. However, he made an unusual mark at the Library of Congress during his long tenure there. Murray joined the staff of the Library of Congress in 1871. From 1874 to 1897, he was personal assistant to Ainsworth R. Spofford, Librarian of Congress, and was also an assistant librarian beginning in 1880. In the 1923 report of the Librarian of Congress, the then librarian, Herbert Putnam, opined that Murray's extraordinary record, exceeded in the Library of Congress probably in but a single instance, was remarkable in the almost unbroken continuity and regularity of his attendance. However, regularity of attendance at the Library of Congress was not the only claim to fame of Murray. Murray was curator of a collection of black books and pamphlets that was the outgrowth of an exhibit of Negro Anna prepared for the Paris Exposition of 1900. It later was called the Murray Collection. Murray edited his preliminary list of books and pamphlets by Negro authors for the exposition, a landmark bibliography of the Black American experience. Abstract. Papers of Daniel Murray, a prominent Afro-American historian and bibliographer who worked at the Library of Congress between 1871 and 1922, and during his lifetime compiled an Encyclopedia of the Colored Race. Including over 25,000 biographical sketches and over 6,000 titles of black-authored publications, the 6-volume encyclopedia was never published. The papers include extensive correspondence, 1893 to 1925, notes and biographical sketches for the encyclopedia, materials documenting efforts to publish the encyclopedia, speeches and articles, business papers, programs and brochures, and family papers. The papers also document Murray's civic activities such as his work with the Colored American Council. Primary correspondents include Murray's wife, Anna Jane Evans Murray, and 2 sons, Daniel Evans Murray and George Henry Murray. While still quite young, Robert Mara Adger, 1837 to 1910, joined the Banneker Institute and began his lifelong mission as a bibliophile. Adger, who was born free in Charleston, South Carolina, was brought by his parents to Philadelphia at the age of 6, and lived there for the rest of his life. A businessman and political activist, Adger was one of the founders of the Afro-American Historical Society in 1897. He amassed a large collection of books and other materials concerning the anti-slavery movement. In his collection were autograph letters, prints, and engravings totaling some 800 items. A dealer in rare books and prints, Adger compiled 2 printed catalogs of his collection. Each item listed in his later catalog, dated May 1906, is priced, thereby revealing the market value of this type of material at that time. No item listed cost more than $5. A first edition of Phyllis Wheatley poems with the author's portrait sold for $1.25. Benjamin Drew's The Refugee, or The Narrative of Fugitive Slaves in Canada, published in Boston in 1856, cost 50 cents, and Rainsford Santo Domingo with engraved plates of Toussaint Louverture and others, was $5. Adger was active in Philadelphia church and community affairs and served as first president of the American Negro Historical Society and as a trustee of the First African Presbyterian Church. He died in Philadelphia at the age of 73 on June 6, 1910. To keep the past in lively memory, William Carl Bolivar's efforts to preserve African American cultural heritage. By William C. Welburn. The contributions of William Carl Bolivar, a Philadelphia African American bibliophile and journalist, are considered. Bolivar's interest in historical documentation shaped his sense of interconnectedness with the collective memory of Philadelphia's black community. His collecting interests are manifested in his column published in the Philadelphia Tribune, in his contributions to the American Negro Historical Society and other social and cultural organizations in Philadelphia, and in a published catalog of portions of his collection. Bolivar's network of collectors and associates formed a nucleus for a larger effort to preserve African American cultural heritage. Their collecting efforts formed the foundation for black collections and collecting practices today and were integral to the development of African American historical studies and African diaspora studies in general. Although Schomburg did not meet Adger until just before his death, he became a close friend of Adger's fellow collector and book dealer William Carl Bolivar, affectionately known as Billy or Uncle Billy. Bolivar and Schomburg often combed Philadelphia and New York bookstores and visited auction galleries and museums together. Bolivar's family had lived in Philadelphia since 1800 and proudly traced its ancestry back to the American Revolution. William Bolivar was born on April 18, 1849 and studied at Philadelphia's Institute. In William Carl Bolivar, Schomburg found another inspiring older companion who served as Schomburg's guide whenever he visited Quakertown. The two also carried on a regular correspondence, often going into considerable detail in the description and assessment of their latest acquisitions.
Namesake of the school, and this is Reverend Alexander Crummell, an abolitionist colleague of Frederick Douglass, a mentor to W.E.B. Du Bois, founder of a number of institutions, but the the American Negro Academy and published multiple books about the plight of Black Americans in the late 1800s, early 1900s, or late 1800s. I think he actually passed in 1898, if I remember. He was founder of St. Luke's Episcopal Church at 15th and P Streets Northwest, and really a leader in the desegregation of the Episcopal Church, founder of the Union of Black Episcopalians. And he is credited as the father of Pan-Africanism, and influencer of Marcus Garvey and others on Pan-African thought. So I wanted to just share that so that you could see this picture of this man, and also the church behind him. That is St. Luke's Episcopal Church that Reverend Gale actually led until just recently. So I would love, Reverend Gale, for you to just share a little.
This growing racial awakening and the sporadic excursions into the African past were canalized in the Negro Society for Historical Research. Launched in the United States in 1911 by John E. Bruce and Arthur A. Schomburg, a Puerto Rican of African origin, the society seems to have been inspired by the American Negro Academy started by Alexander Crummell on March 5, 1897. Both Bruce and Schomburg were associated with the American Negro Academy, the former as an executive member, the latter as sometime president. Among the New World. The American Negro Academy, founded 1895, is an organization perfected by Reverend Alexander Cromwell, of which Dr. Du Bois is president. Honorable Archibald H. Grimke, Professor Kelly Miller and Reverend Frank Grimke are among its members. The most important features of the Academy, to the race, are the Occasional Papers series published and distributed by it. Closely akin to the Academy is the American Negro Historical Society of Philadelphia, founded in 1897. The object of this society is to collect relics, literature, and historical facts, relative to the Negro race, illustrating their progress and development in this country. It is the ultimate purpose of this society to secure title to a permanent home for its meetings and a safe deposit for its effects. Reverend Henry L. Phillips, Reverend Matthew Anderson and William C. Bolivar are among its members. When Bruce died in 1924, Florence Bruce gave the bulk of his collection to Schomburg, keeping only a few items she wanted for personal memories. William Carl Bolivar was 7 years Bruce's senior, a corresponding member of the NSHR, a charter member of the American Negro Historical Society, and the cousin of Daniel Murray. He was known to some of his fellow collectors as Uncle Billy. Bolivar published his first article on Philadelphia's black community in 1866 and by 1892 regularly contributed columns on black history to the Philadelphia Tribune. In 1907 he became the director of the Department of Negro History at Downingtown, Pennsylvania. Bolivar's collection was divided up among a number of friends and collectors, including Schomburg, Slaughter, and possibly Bruce.
19th and early 20th century bibliophiles of Black print culture: Robert Adger, William Bolivar, Daniel A.P. Murray, and Arturo Schomburg, among others.
Bibliography's historical connection with book collecting has pegged it as an elite endeavor. The Black bibliophiles and bibliographers undertook such work as early as the mid-19th century and approached it with distinctively different values. Literary historian Tony Martin notes that Black bibliophiles collected books to counter the pseudo-scientific racism that was so prevalent during the 19th century. Importantly, these early collections focused on ancient African and Egyptian history to prove the greatness and civilization of Black peoples prior to enslavement. They also aimed to collect materials printed across the Black diaspora, acquiring titles from the Caribbean, South America, Europe, and Africa to knit together global networks of Black print communities. Committed to education, Black bibliophiles preserve printed works as proof of Black achievement and as a legacy for future generations. For that reason, their collections extended beyond books to include pamphlets, newspapers, and newspaper clippings. In an era when public libraries, like other public facilities, often refused access to Black readers, Black collectors acquired materials to make them available to the public, stressing their use as much as their display. Finally, Black bibliophiles pooled their resources to collect works communally. This was the strategy of the 1915 American Negro Collectors Exchange, a practice with its roots in the early 19th century Black reading rooms and literary societies, a world that Elizabeth McHenry recovers so brilliantly in Forgotten Readers. In these ways, collecting was an act of political activism, an ongoing attempt to correct the record of American history by preserving writings that documented Black presence, contributions, and struggles towards freedom.
Though Black bibliophiles also wrote about their own collections, producing catalogs.
Bookstores and bibliophiles. African American bookstores and bibliophiles, book lovers, have played an integral part in Black intellectual life. The early bibliophiles often became booksellers as well, and their collections formed the nucleus of many of the outstanding special Black collections in libraries, particularly those in the historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs. The work of these pioneers continues and has been the inspiration for building numerous private collections that are in Black homes today. Such collecting is a trend in African American popular culture. Two early African American booksellers were David Ruggles and Robert Adger. The first known African American bookseller was David Ruggles, 1810–49. An abolitionist, printer, and pamphleteer of the 1830s. He was a bibliophile as well. Ruggles opened a bookstore at 67 Lisbonnet Street, New York City, in 1834 and sold anti-slavery works and stationery. Robert Mara Adger, 1837–1919, a Philadelphia merchant and an abolitionist, was also involved in numerous activities for racial uplift. He built an enormous private collection and became a bookseller as well. He produced catalogs of his collection in 1894 and 1906, attracting the interest of bibliophiles. Book collectors as cultural keepers. Black bibliophiles run through our history like an unseen hand, wrote Tony Martin in Black Bibliophiles and Collectors. This statement holds for the early collectors in our history as well as for those of contemporary Black America. African American book collectors are responsible for many of the major developments in our culture. They established Black America's early historical societies, its first literary and debating societies, and special collections of African Americana. By 1915, interest in collecting books by Black authors had become so widespread that a group of Black book lovers organized the Negro Book Collectors Exchange during a meeting of the American Negro Academy in Washington, D.C. Its mission was to bring together all literature by people of color, and serious bibliophiles were elected officers. They included Henry Proctor Slaughter, Arthur Alfonso Schomburg, Charles Douglas Martin, John Edward Bruce, and Daniel Alexander Murray. These men held sizable personal libraries that later became a part of the special African American collections at Atlanta University, Howard University, and the Library of Congress. The leading bibliophiles of 1800s and early 1900s, many of them wealthy, lived in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. They bought private collections and also helped to build collections for organizations. Jacob C. White, Jr., of Philadelphia, is an example. As secretary for many local black organizations, he gathered documents for their libraries as well as for his own. Some bibliophiles established private museums in their homes and included book collections in the museum as well. For example, William H. Dorsey, a wealthy Philadelphia bibliophile, devoted several rooms in his home to his museum. As far back as the 1820s, these collectors also organized reading rooms and library companies for blacks in Philadelphia. They also helped to build institutional libraries. The leading bibliophiles of 1800s and early 1900s, many of them wealthy, lived in Philadelphia, New York, and Washington, D.C. They bought private collections and also helped to build collections for organizations. Jacob C. White, Jr., of Philadelphia, is an example. As secretary for many local black organizations, he gathered documents for their libraries as well as for his own. Some bibliophiles established private museums in their homes and included book collections in the museum as well. For example, William H. Dorsey, a wealthy Philadelphia bibliophile, devoted several rooms in his home to his museum. As far back as the 1820s, these collectors also organized reading rooms and library companies for blacks in Philadelphia. They also helped to build institutional libraries. During the late 19th century, in the midst of the United States Civil War, two free black men set out to plan an art exhibition. At a time when the future of chattel slavery in black life hung in the balance of a national quarrel, these men, William H. Dorsey and Edward M. Thomas, negotiated their precarious freedoms through the collection and promotion of black art. Thomas, who worked for the government as a messenger of the House of Representatives, had established himself outside of work as a fervent collector of art and literature. His collection, which boasted 600 volumes, artworks, coinage, autographs, and archival documents, was stored in his home at the corner of Washington, D.C.'s K and 17th Streets. Starting in 1862, Thomas would begin planning his dream exhibition, putting out a call for submissions in the black press titled, Colored Inventors, Artists, Mechanics, and Intent on creating an exhibition that celebrated black innovation and artistry, Thomas found support and collaboration for the project working alongside other black art collectors, like Dorsey. Connecting with a 19th-century black history and art collector. William Henry Dorsey was not only an artist but a collector. That's not unusual. What is unusual is that he was both at a time when black folks were struggling to survive the dehumanization of slavery. He was building on a collection of African American art, books, and memorabilia inherited from his father. Journalist/editor James Wesley Cromwell wrote about the collection in Frederick Douglass' New National Era newspaper in 1874. After seeing it, he was just as excited as I was about learning of it. Cromwell and Dorsey were among a small group of African American history collectors during the 19th century. Several books from Cromwell's own library were recently sold at Swan Auction Galleries in New York. His other books and papers are at Howard University. On that day in September 1874, Cromwell took the stairs to the second floor of Dorsey's home at 206 Dean Street in Philadelphia. Several rooms had been converted into a museum. The house had belonged to Dorsey's father, Thomas, one of the city's most prominent caterers and prosperous citizens. When Thomas died in 1875, he left behind enough capital for his family to maintain their lifestyle. William, the oldest child and only son who was born in 1837, saw himself as more an artist than a caterer. Self-taught, he was entering in an arena that American society thought black people could not master. It took an inner creativity to produce something as wondrous as art, and in society's view, black folks just didn't have it. James Wesley Cromwell, historian, journalist and editor. He wrote enthusiastically about William H. Dorsey's collection. That's not what Cromwell saw in the home of a man who had been a fellow student at the Institute for Colored Youth, which later became Cheney University. Dorsey's rooms were perhaps the first museum setting for Black history documentation. It was in the front room of the second story of one of those small but cozy homes of the many narrow streets of Philadelphia that we were ushered into a miniature museum and art gallery, the private collection of our old friend, Mr. William H. Dorsey, of that city, Cromwell wrote. Our surprise at what was in store for us was so unexpected and complete, and withal so pleasant, that we cannot resist the temptation to give the readers of the national era an opportunity of realizing the same pleasure. To the lover of art, the admirer of rare curiosities, or the antiquarian, the collection of Mr. Dorsey would alike afford delight, the coins and minerals, the implements of warfare used by savage and barbarous nations, the ancient mosaics, the fine engravings, the oil and watercolor paintings by artists of established reputation, would repay a most critical examination. The volumes of books overwhelmed him with delight, books and pamphlets, published by, and concerning colored men and women, the music by colored composers, the number of steel and copperplate engravings of eminent Negroes, and photographs, autograph letters, autographs and facsimiles of men prominent in our race is very extensive, interesting, and valuable. While Dorsey was filling his museum, he worked as a civil servant under 2 mayors, as a personal messenger in the office of one and a turnkey of another. As a turnkey, he apparently was a jailer who kept the keys and locked the cells of prisoners in a city hall jail. Dorsey died in 1923. His scrapbooks are presumably all that's left of his collection in his name. He and Thomas were their century's version of Arthur Schomburg and Charles Blockson, who in the 20th century compiled their own collections. The former had no repository for theirs, so their collections disappeared. Schomburg's is housed in a New York Public Library research library in Harlem that bears his name. Blockson's is in a center at Temple University in Philadelphia that is named after him. The volumes of books overwhelmed him with delight, books and pamphlets, published by, and concerning colored men and women, the music by colored composers, the number of steel and copperplate engravings of eminent Negroes, and photographs, autograph letters, autographs and facsimiles of men prominent in our race is very extensive, interesting, and valuable. One of the earliest descriptions of Thomas's Washington, D.C., based collection was published in an 1860 edition of the Weekly Anglo-African. Remarking on the existence of black collectors, the article stated, "Many valuable collections may be found among our people, which are acquired not merely for show, but for actual study and service." In the article, several artworks by John G. Chaplin, William Simpson, and Dorsey are emphasized as notable pieces in Thomas's collection. Shifting gears from its inventory of Thomas's acquisitions, the Weekly Anglo-African article posed an important rhetorical question about the collection's owner, who would imagine that in Washington such a collection would be found to be the private property of a colored man. This question, posed by a member of the black press and published in a black publication, conveys an understanding of the relationship between blackness and property in the Americas. Embedded in the question is an answer of sorts. No one would imagine that a collection of this kind could belong to a colored man, because an entirely different property relation precedes the advent of the black art collector, one of blackness and black people as property to be owned. In 1897, Dorsey along with collector and historian/activist Robert Adger and others founded the American Negro Historical Society, whose mission was to study and preserve black history. This was a decade before historian Carter G. Woodson organized the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History with the mission of highlighting the history through his own writings and publications. Dorsey's contemporary, Edward M. Thomas, was also a notable collector. His home library was the subject of an article in the New York Weekly Anglo-African newspaper in 1860. The writer, a man who identified himself as Box, recounted his experience of visiting Thomas's library. Over the years, many works by and about black authors were largely ignored and sometimes discarded as worthless. Flea markets and second-hand shops often sold these works for as little as a few cents. Pathetically, white teachers often told their black students that blacks had no history and that there were no books by and about them. Because of such misinformation and unfamiliarity with black literature, the efforts of many book collectors became increasingly significant, for they preserved black history and culture and had documentation to refute the arguments of pseudo-scholars. Early African American book collectors included those mentioned as book sellers, the officers and members of the American Negro Academy, and others, such as Benjamin W. Arnett, Arna Bontam, Benjamin G. Brawley, W. Montague Cobb, Anna Julia Cooper, John Wesley Cromwell, Owen Dodson, William H. Dorsey, W. E. B. Dubois, Charles L. Hartman, Clarence L. Holt, Harold Jackson, Charles Spurgeon Johnson, Alan Leroy Locke, Jesse E. Moreland, Dan I.E.L. Alexander Payne Murray, Arthur Alfonso Schomburg, Henry Proctor Slaughter, William Grant Still, and Monroe Nathan Work. Contemporary collectors include those with a broad interest in Afro-Americana, such as Charles L. Blockson, and those with a narrow interest who collect black cookbooks, fiction by black women writers, and books on black memorabilia. Their collections enrich a number of libraries. For example, Holt sold his collection to Ahmadu Bello University in Zaria, Nigeria. Blockson's collection went to Temple University. The collections of Jackman and Slaughter are at the Robert W. Woodruff Library, Atlanta University Center. Schomburg's collection is at the Schomburg Center. For research in black culture in Harlem, the Moreland collection is a part of the Moreland Spingarn Research Center at Howard University, and some of the Du Bois materials are at Fisk University. Another was a life-size portrait of Thomas as well as a watercolor by Dorsey, described as young and talented, of a tower in ruins. Who would imagine in Washington that such a collection would be found to be the private property of a colored man? Many valuable collections may be found among our people, which are acquired not merely for show, but for actual study and service, Box wrote. Around 1861, Thomas and Dorsey, among others, began planning an exhibit of the black artists around at the time. Thomas died in 1863 before it could be implemented. B.J.O. Moguire and C.O., auctioneers. Bare and valuable collection of coins, autographs, and books. On Tuesday evening, January 10th, at 7 o'clock, at the auction rooms, corner of 10th and D Streets. We shall sell, by catalog, a rare and valuable collection of Owens, autographs and books, collected by Edward M. Thomas, a colored man, a resident of this city, who died in February, 1863, and now sold for the benefit of his widow. Odalogues now ready for delivery, and may be obtained at the auction room. Jan 5d. J. C. McGuire and C.O. Ox. Advertisement for an auction of Edward M. Thomas's books. Autographs and coins in Washington, D.C. in 1865.
Tonight, we take a look at the little-known story about how Black History Month started and why we celebrate it in February. Here's CBS's Adriana Diaz.
Good morning, scholars.
On urban historian Sherman Thomas's Black History Month bus tour.
And if you look out of what is now the East Windows, that is the building where the birth of Black History Month happened.
All roads lead to this former YMCA, one of the first to welcome Black Americans. Here in 1915, Carter G. Woodson, who was born to former slaves and went to the University of Chicago and Harvard, created the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History.
And that association decided to come up with Negro Achievement Week, which is the precursor to Black History Month.
Thomas says they chose February
because it contained the birthday of Abraham Lincoln and the made-up birthday of Frederick Douglass.
And created Black history materials for teachers who sometimes taught it in secret.
I think there are a lot of parallels comparing what's happening now with the banning of Black history books and what Dr. Carter G. Woodson was attempting to do, trying to not use the lessons of the past to shame anyone, but to make sure that we don't repeat those same mistakes.
Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham is a Harvard history professor whose father worked with Woodson.
For him, the idea of a week was never a week. It was always 365 days. He was a builder. He brought people together.
I think he'd be very proud of the history that we've made, and I think he would agree that we still have a little ways to go.
Adriana Diaz, CBS News, Chicago.
So where we at today? We are at the David Ruggles boarding house. So some history about David Ruggles. David Ruggles was born in Norwich, Connecticut around 1810. Around 1830, he moved to New York City, where he was a part of an anti-slavery movement. He had his own grocery store, which he converted to a library because white African Americans was denied access to public libraries in New York City. It became the first Black-owned library in New York City. Shortly after, it was destroyed, though, by the mob. Why? The scriptures say, Nehemiah 2:10, that anytime somebody rises up for their people, it grieved the nations. So it grieved the mob. That's why he destroyed his library. At his new location in Lisbonard Street, David Ruggles' home served as a boarding house for the Underground Railroad, where he helped many enslaved African Americans with food, with shelter. Also, very renowned writer Frederick Douglass, he was also here. Family, tune in next time for more history that you may have not known.
Amidst this backdrop of cultural imperialism, a few African-American educators stood out. Among them were Frederick Douglass Bonner, John Henry Manning Butler, and notably Carter G. Woodson. These men, though part of the American educational mission, brought with them a different perspective, shaped by their own experiences of racism and subjugation in their homeland. The African-American teachers like Woodson arrived in the Philippines with a unique mission. They were not merely educators, they were bridges between cultures, understanding the nuances of being peoples of color under a dominant power. Bonner and Butler, for instance, immersed themselves in the Filipino communities based on mutual respect and understanding. Woodson, on the other hand, during his time in the Philippines, witnessed firsthand the impact of the American education system. He saw how it was used as a tool to propagate white supremacy, to indoctrinate young minds with the ideals that served the imperialist agenda. This experience would profoundly influence his later work, The Miseducation of the Negro, which would later also inspire Renato Constantino to write The Miseducation of the Filipino. In the Philippines, Woodson observed a similar pattern of miseducation as he had seen in America. The curriculum imposed by the Americans was a reflection of their inherent racism and imperialism. It taught nothing of the Filipino context, nothing of our own people's history or our own indigenous cultures. Instead, it focused on instilling the English language and American customs, while punishing any expression of Filipino identities. This experience was eye-opening for Woodson. He realized that the struggle struggle against miseducation was not just an African-American issue, but a universal one. It was a battle against a system designed to control minds, to dictate who was worthy of knowledge and who was not. Unknown to many, Woodson's time in the Philippines was a critical juncture, shaping his resolve to fight against the miseducation of his own people back in the United States. Carter G. Woodson emerged from his Philippine experience transformed. He returned to the United States with a renewed purpose, dedicating his life to correcting the injustices he had witnessed. Woodson's work was not just about reclaiming African American history, it was about reasserting their identity and place in the world. His efforts culminated in the creation of Negro History Week, a celebration of Black identity and achievements. This event was a beacon of hope and a call to African Americans to embrace their heritage with pride. It was a radical act of defiance against a system that had long sought to diminish their contributions to society. Decades later, this celebration would evolve into the Black History Month that we know today, a testament to Woodson's enduring legacy. But his influence did not stop there. The spirit of his work transcended oceans, inspiring similar movements among Filipino Americans and other marginalized communities. For example, in October, we celebrate Filipino American History Month, a time to honor our own journey and contributions. Woodson's legacy is a beacon of resilience and solidarity. He showed us that our histories are interconnected, that our struggles against oppression and miseducation are shared. He laid the foundation for movements that seek not just to reclaim history, but to rectify it in a way that honors the diversity of human experiences. Today, Carter G. Woodson is hailed as the father of Black history, but his legacy goes beyond that. He is a symbol of the fight for knowledge, for the right to tell our own histories. His work reminds us that our history is not just a collection of dates and events, but a living, breathing narrative that shapes our identities and our future. Now, before we continue into the final chapter of today's journey, I just want to share something that is close to my heart. If you're inspired by today's topic, and if you wish to deepen your understanding about these forgotten chapters of our people's history, I invite you to please check out my book, Black Lives and Brown Freedom: Untold Histories of War, Solidarity, and Genocide. And it's actually my very first book. This book is a deeper journey into the forgotten history of solidarity between Filipinos and African Americans during the Philippine-American War. From Captain David Fagan in the battlefields in the Philippines to Ida B. Wells Barnett in the United States, it's a labor of love and respect aiming to shed light on these intertwined histories and honor the shared struggles and resilience of our communities. And if you are new to my channel and wish to support the continuation of uplifting and sharing these stories, please consider becoming a patron on Patreon or a member of my YouTube channel. You may also check out my books, coloring books, ebooks, and merch about the Philippines, Southeast Asia, the diaspora, and beyond. Your support for my book, my very first book, will also support my continued research and storytelling, decolonized storytelling about our people's history, culture, and everything in between. So make sure to check out the links below to order your copies today. And as we say in my mother tongue, dakal pong salamat. And actually, apart from my book, for those of you who may not be familiar with the Philippine-American War and the genocide and the American occupation of the Philippines, check out the links below or up here. Ay, baliktad. Check out the links up here or down below for the YouTube playlist that I made about the Philippine Revolution and struggle for liberation, which includes all my videos about these topics, including videos about the many African Americans who fought for our people's liberation. So make sure to watch them after this video. Now back to our topic. Carter G. Woodson's journey in the Philippines was more than just an educational mission. It was a profound awakening. He witnessed the mechanisms of imperialist education and how it was used to subjugate and control Filipinos. This experience was a revelation, shedding light on the broader struggle against colonialism and white supremacy. In his famous book, Woodson wrote, "When you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions." And this insight was a direct result of his observations in the Philippines. He understood that the battle for liberation was not just fought on physical grounds, but in the minds and the hearts of the people. Woodson's time in the Philippines exposed him to the stark realities of imperialist and white supremacist education and its ability to dictate narratives, to suppress indigenous voices, to enforce hegemony, and to ignite cultural genocide. This realization spurred Woodson to dedicate his life to combating the miseducation of African Americans. He recognized the parallels between the struggles of the Black people and those of the Filipinos. He understood that both were victims of a system designed to erase their histories and impose white supremacy. This shared experience became a catalyst for Woodson, fueling his passion to safeguard the legacy of African Americans. Carter G. Woodson, alongside other Black luminaries like W.E.B. Du Bois and I.W. Wells Barnett, became a vanguard in the movement for decolonization and liberation. Their efforts were not just about reclaiming history, they were about dismantling the very structures that perpetuated oppression and injustices. They fought for the right to self-representation, to break free from the narratives imposed by white supremacist colonial powers. Woodson's work transcended national boundaries, resonating with the oppressed communities around the world. In the Philippines, for example, where American heroes like George Washington were exalted at the expense of our own bayanis or heroes, Carter G. Woodson and his contemporaries offered a more genuine narrative, one that celebrated resistance, resilience, and the quest for liberation. They reminded us that our histories are not defined by the colonizers, but by the struggles and the triumphs of our people. And as we draw the curtains on the legacy of Carter G. Woodson and the intertwined histories of Filipinos and African Americans, we also reflect on the profound solidarity that arose during the Philippine-American War. Figures like I.W. Wells Barnett, Captain David Fagan, and the countless African Americans who empathized with the Filipino struggle and joined our people's fight for liberation remind us of the enduring power of solidarity in the face of adversity. And if you think about it, Carter G. Woodson's journey from the classrooms of the Philippines to the heart of the African American struggle in the US, coupled with the many acts of solidarity across oceans, are a testament to the power of education as a tool for liberation. Carter G. Woodson's legacy and the shared history of our struggles challenge us to look beyond the narratives handed down to us and to seek our own truth. So let's honor this legacy by continuing to question the mainstream narrative, by continuing to learn and to grow from our people's histories, and by continuing the unwavering spirit of unity and solidarity that binds our people across borders and struggles. So this Black History Month and beyond, not just today but every day in our lives, let's keep the flames of knowledge and solidarity burning brighter. Let's pave the way for a future that truly honors and empowers our diverse cultures, diverse histories, and diverse people. A future where genuine peace and justice.
When I was in the 4th grade, I had a substitute teacher. And one day we were talking about American history. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin, others who contributed to the founding of this country. And I raised my hand. I asked her about the colored people, as we were called, the Negro. Do we have a history? She said, no, Charles. Negroes were born to serve white people. There was a time in our history where we weren't permitted to read and write. A time in our history where any person caught with a book or reading and write, they were often whipped. But we have come a long way. Collecting is important. I call myself a bibliophile, which I love books. I'm a bibliophile, a book lover. I love to smell old books. I love to feel them. I like to go to the bookstores, get on my knees in antique shops and barns and all the other places. You can always pick them up. And you can always read them when you're lonely, when you're curious. Unfortunately, I guess I'm sort of a dying breed. I hope I'm not.
Charles Leroy Blockson was born in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression to Annie Parker Blockson and Charles Edward Blockson. The eldest of 8 children, he spent his childhood in Norristown, Pennsylvania.
We had people of all races and colors and creeds on my street. Our parents told us there were certain things that colored a Negro that we would have to endure, because there was, even in Norristown, there were places that we couldn't go. So we had this de facto segregation.
Spurred by his teacher's painful words, Blockson unknowingly began what would become a lifelong journey to unearth, collect, and preserve the history, culture, and contributions of people of African descent.
I went into the Salvation Army stores and Goodwill stores looking for any book that said Negro, colored, African, West Indian, or black. So I started to collect.
The budding historian and collector was also a star athlete in multiple sports, from junior high through his college years at Penn State. Even while playing sports, Blockson always found his way back to books. Later in life, he would turn down an opportunity to play professional football in favor of his collecting.
So wherever I traveled playing sports, where other teammates would go to the parties, I would go to the bookstores, then I would go to the parties. My roommates and teammates wondered, why do you always go to those bookstores? They didn't really know what I was collecting. In my room, my books competed under the bed with my boxing gloves, my footballs, my shot put and discus, and all the other stuff. So it was a competition right there between books, athletics, and so forth. I'm glad that the books won out. I didn't have any idea at all that it would extend as far as it has over the years. It was more to pacify my own soul and intellect. And I guess underneath, from a psychological point of view, to prove my teacher wrong. So from a little boy curious going from the Salvation Army to Goodwill stores, my book collection excursion have taken me to many parts of the world. And it's led me to donating my first collection here at Temple University in 1984. The second collection is at Penn State.
The Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection is one of our nation's leading research facilities for the study of the history and culture of people of African descent. We have over 700,000 items in the collection, which range from rare books, prints, newspapers, illustrations, pamphlets, music, personal archival collections, a whole host of materials.
But these are like some images from Cheney.
Why don't you get a copy of the book? Oh, we could just hold it there.
And because Mr. Blockson started collecting when he was 9 years old, this is like a one-stop place.
My mother saved everything, all these photographs to the book, luckily. Let me see.
Just about every project I've done, I always come to the collection because everything's here. And on top of that, I just like to pick a book off the shelf to read sometimes.
I have books, the oldest book in the 1500s, and books about poetry, books about children, and all kinds of images to tell our story. In order to tell the whole history, the true history, you must include the pride and prejudice. One of the most important books in the collection was called The Underground Railroad. When I was a little boy, my grandfather would sing a song at the Highway to Heaven, walking up the King's Highway. I said, "Grandpa, what are you singing about?" He said, "I'm singing about the Underground Railroad." He said, "My father, your great-grandfather, escaped on the Underground Railroad, went to Canada. The code word for Canada was heaven." So it came back to me. I looked in the book and found page 488. It said, "Arrival from Sussex County, Delaware. It's 1858. And the first name, it says Jacob Blockson." So it verified what my grandfather was talking about, his father and his relatives, escaped through the Underground Railroad. Later I found they escaped, several of them with Harriet Tubman.
Throughout his career, Charles Blockson has written articles and books about the Underground Railroad. His connection with Harriet Tubman grew even stronger when he was entrusted with several personal items belonging to the abolitionist by her great-grandniece. He donated those items to the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in 2010.
You can see on the back of the card lots of interesting information about where the photo.
I like to bring my students to the collection so that they can see the range of African American materials. Images of African Americans where they were. I want the students to see the text that we're reading within a broader context. Here's this complicated, intricate, interwoven body of material that crosses all kinds of geographic, cultural lines. This is a collection that you could come to and be surprised and make a discovery.
Phyllis Wheatley is one of the epitomes of collecting. She was enslaved and brought to America and sold to a Quaker family in Boston, Massachusetts. She learned to read and write, and she started to write poetry. In 1773, she had the honor of becoming the first woman of African descent to publish a book of poetry. There's only about 6 or 7 known copies of this book. I was in love with her. She haunted me here, haunted me there. Whenever I went to a bookstore, a rare bookstore around the country, someone would beat me to it. So a friend of mine, an old bookseller, sent me the copy of Phyllis Wheatley, and paging through the book, tears came into my eyes when I realized that this book, this young lady who haunted me from bookstore to bookstore, I finally held her in my hand, and I didn't realize until I looked, it's signed by her. It was an autographed copy of Phyllis Wheatley. This book is a cornerstone of American literature as well as African American literature. The Paul Robeson sculpture was created by Antonio Salemi back in 1925. Paul Robeson was internationally known as actor, singer, scholar. I was drawn to him because I used to listen to his records when I was young. I was able to meet with him 3 times when he was in Philadelphia. I donated a huge collection of Robeson items pertaining to his life here at the collection. The postcards existed from the 1890s up until around the 1970s. They would mock people of African descent. People would go away on vacation and send them back to friends and families.
It's these African Americans, their bodies still exploited and put on display, without consideration or respect for the dignity of human life, and that they would be mass-produced and then distributed in such a careless way was very illuminating, because you see the address on the back and you see that someone actually went and bought and sent this, and that really brought that home to me.
The shackles are very emotional. I hesitated in the beginning whether I should even try to preserve them. But nevertheless, they sort of went along with the books and manuscripts that I have pertaining to enslavement. To know that my own ancestors were enslaved. There's a story behind these shackles that is a part of the history. My eyes was always on the positive as well as the negative. This is the negative part of our history. This is the key that inserts into the lock here to open the lock. They made them for the arms and the ankles, and sometimes they had them around the mouth.
For a lot of students, and I think for a lot of Americans, ideas about slavery are so removed from our everyday experiences. And so to look at something and imagine an item like that being worn by another human being is just, it's very sad.
from the shackles, we emerged into writers, judges, preachers, ministers, actors, all kinds of endeavors in life. It gives me strength and determination to carry on.
This collection tells a story of tremendous diversity. There's something to be said not just for the materials that are collected, but just the process of collecting and creating this archive that says this is a sacred project, and that these are important materials. This is a story worth telling. And so you see, African American culture has been foundational in the development of American society.
Charles Blockson is not only a collector, but an educator, historian, and author, writing articles and books on varied topics, including Black genealogy. He has championed the placement of markers at significant African American historical locations around Philadelphia, and has become one of the Philadelphia area's most trusted and treasured voices.
We call him a gentle giant.
It's so good to see you.
He's a warrior, too. He encourages everyone to document their histories.
I have to be very careful.
Whenever he walks in the room, people just are in awe of him.
Oh, thank you. You didn't bother me all week, so I'm doing good.
Well, that's why I did, so you would be glad to see me today. Because more than anything else, he's been dedicated and committed to the preservation and dissemination and documentation of African American history and culture. And he's been consistent with that over the years, even when it wasn't in vogue.
And I can get copies of this, so I can get copies for our classroom libraries at school.
I have a few more at home.
Oh, it's always great. He knows everyone, and if he doesn't know someone, you can never tell because he's just so open with people.
Do you have a copy of Moses yet?
It's impressive, too, because whatever you're working on, he'll just look over and he'll be able to tell you all about whatever you're doing, so he's a really smart man.
Years later, about 20, 30 years later, I met my school teacher, and she apologized. She said she didn't know when she told me Negroes were born to serve white people. She said she was always hurt because this is the way she was taught. She said she's proud of what I was doing as far as our history, so I didn't hold any grudges. It was like I forgave her. The only way to improve ourselves is to understand people of all races, their history, their contribution to this country and to the world. I hope that I have given unto the world something of myself, part of my soul, to whoever would accept it, and that they would also pass it on. I realize my life ambition. I believe that by being a collector, to collect, preserve, and to disseminate this knowledge. Knowledge belongs to the world, and my experience from books and so forth should be passed on.
Support for this program was provided by Penn State's Office of the Vice Provost for Educational Equity and from viewers like you. Thank you.
At DJ Biggs 2 days ago. Exit left : Minion. Happy Black History Month FBA. FBA DNA hip hop all day. At Incredible Hulk 777. DJ Biggs bro, let me tell you something about Black history. The reason why Black history exists today is because a Puerto Rican named Arturo Alfonso Schomburg created it with over 10 million artifacts that he collected from around the world and put it all in a museum in New York so that American blacks and all blacks from around the world can see and study their history and culture. So, in short words, a Puerto Rican is the father of Black history. Google it.